Okay, we're going to review the whole semester now. Are we ready? So, first we talked about social construction. Social construction is the way that humans create ideas. We contrasted that with essentialism, the idea that different ideas come from something essential, whether that's God or nature or our biology. And we talked about the way that social construction is an active process that changes historically. So, the way we understand gender and many other things is created by society and changes over time. We looked at social institutions. These are ways of organizing society. Examples were education, marriage, criminal justice system, and so forth. And we learn about how social institutions enforce social values, teach them. This process of teaching is called socialization. And then we talked about the social structure, which is all those social institutions put together. And across the social structure, we socially construct and socialize values, ideas, ways of understanding the world. We talked about how social institutions tend to resist change, tend to stay the same over time, but also that there was space within them for agency. And agency is defined as the ability of individuals to make choices on what actions they're going to take and how they're going to respond to, how they're going to feel about the social structure in which they find themselves. So we have this balance where, on the one hand, the social structure is very powerful, it tends to want to stay the same, it tends to perpetuate certain ideas over time. But on the other hand, as individuals, we have the ability, and there are many examples in history of this happening, to make changes to it, to respond to it in different ways. We then talked about stereotypes, bias, discrimination, and prejudice, different types of ways of acting or thinking negatively about different groups, and we defined those in different ways, and we saw how each one led to the next one. And then we talked about how these happen across institutions. So when we have discrimination, prejudice happening across institutions, then that creates the embedment, meaning the solidification, the repetition of social power. We talked about how this happens across the entire social structure, and that's called structural oppression. And we talked about how, while stereotypes and bias and so forth can be held by any groups of people, only those groups of people who have structural power can engage in structural oppression because they're the only ones who have access to the means to do so. We then talked about a number of different structures of oppression that exist in our society. The first was patriarchy. This is the system where men are in charge, where masculinity is seen as superior, and where sexism occurs, the oppression of women. We also talked about capitalism, which we talked about more later. We talked about all of these more later. But capitalism is where the means of production are owned privately, and it's basically the system where the rich are more powerful and the poor are less powerful. We talked about white supremacy. This is the social structure that gives advantages to people who are white, and people who are people of color are oppressed within it. We call that racism. We talked about heteronormativity, the structure that gives privileges to people who are heterosexual over people that have other sexualities other than straight. And we talked about colonialism, the international system, whereby European countries took control of peoples around the world. And we talked about Orientalism, which is the way of looking at people from outside of the global north as being different, strange, exotic, inferior, uncivilized, those kinds of things. And overall, an important conclusion talking about structural oppression is that these systems just continue themselves if no one does anything to change them. That it doesn't take active involvement of bad people to continue patriarchy, it just takes the fact that it is the social structure, and social structures tend to persist. And that in fact, if we want to change these things, it requires active work. It requires us to do more than just not do really bad things, but actively go out and try and change these structures. And that's hard. Then we talked about the sex gender binary. The binary is the idea that there's only one or the other. There's either male or female, men or women. And we looked at the way we have this set of ideas that all fall within the binary. So our expectation is that men have a penis, they have XY chromosomes, they have testosterone, they're assigned male at birth, they're masculine, they're attracted to women, and that's all one part of the binary, the male side. And then the opposite of all those things is the female part of the binary. So that's the gender binary, the idea that it's one or the other. But then we looked at ways of challenging that. One was to break apart sex and gender, the sex being the physical, biological characteristics, gender being the cultural characteristics, the clothes we wear, the way we act, and so forth, and suggesting that those are actually independent of each other, that we can much more easily make choices about our cultural actions than we can about our physical actions. We also looked into how that was more complicated and how in fact we can also make choices about our physical bodies and how we interpret physical bodies. So this division between sex and gender is useful, but it's not the whole story. We talked about intersex people who have sexual characteristics that don't fit within the binary. And we talked about how we put an awful lot of weight in our society on the sex you are assigned at birth, which is based almost entirely on the genitals, and that in fact all of us have many things about us that don't fit neatly into that binary, and that many of these things exist on a continuum. We talked about gender identity. This is the phrase we use to describe the fact that some people do not have the gender identity that they are assigned at birth. The term for this is trans, so someone whose gender identity is different from their sex assigned at birth. We talked about cis, where people have the sex assigned at birth that's the same as their gender identity. We talked about some of the different words we would use to describe that, and we looked at some language there. And importantly, we talked about how the particular transition people go through is not the definition, just the definition is the sex assigned at birth different from gender identity. We also talked about how trans is not a sexuality and that trans people can have any sexuality. We talked about a number of different sexuality words. We saw that there's a massive spectrum of different ways people understand their sexuality, including asexual people, including people who are pansexual, and including different sexual practices that people engage in, different ways of organizing relationships. And we found that those sexualities exist throughout gender expression, throughout gender identity. The next thing we talked about was intersectionality, this hugely important concept. And intersectionality is the observation that we have multiple identities, all of us, and that our experience is defined by, is controlled by an interaction with those identities. That it's not just that we are a woman one day and gay another day and working class another day and disabled another day. It's that we're all those things at once, and that those come together to affect our experiences. And one of the big takeaways here was that just because we have one particular identity in common with someone else or another group of people doesn't mean we can make assumptions about how their experiences are overall, because they may have many other identities that change those experiences. We looked at Iran as a case study. We talked about how we tend to conflate in America the religion of Islam, Muslims being followers of that religion, Middle Easterners, people from that geographical region of the world, and race, people who are mostly Arab in the Middle East. And we talked about how in Iran most people are Persian. We also looked at the way that we can watch social construction in Iran's history develop in different ways than how it did in America's history, and that this is a good example of evidence that gender is socially constructed. We looked at how we might think of Iran today as being, kind of conservative and traditional, but if we look back in Iran's history, we can find times when that wasn't the case at all, and that historical events are what caused those changes. We also talked about the way the US was involved in those changes and how colonialism mattered for the experience of people in Iran and around the world. And we also looked at this interesting fact that the way that trans is understood and homosexuality is understood is different than the way it is in America. And we use that to question this kind of progressive narrative, this idea that things get steadily better over time in an expected way that we often have in America. Again, this is all evidence of the way these things are all socially constructed, historically dependent. We looked at the Abrahamic religions, that was Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and what we found is they had many, many things in common. That these religions that are often put in opposition to each other, they're seen as in conflict, in fact agree on most things. We looked at monotheism, we looked at the use of religious texts, we looked at the way they understand good and evil, and various other things. And then we also found that within all of these religions, there's incredible diversity. That in many ways, for example, a conservative Muslim might have a lot more in common with a conservative Christian than they do with a liberal Muslim. We talked about anti-Semitism, that's hatred of and discrimination against Jewish people, and we talked about how that's sadly in resurgence in the US today, and we looked at some of the ways that traditional white racists in the US are working together with and combining with anti-Semites, with Nazis, to form a new movement that's called the alt-right. We looked at the way that gender appears in religious institutions, the way that men have tended to take leadership positions in the Abrahamic religions, but we also saw the important role of women in all of these organizations. And then we talked about the impact that these beliefs about God and about sex and gender within the Abrahamic religions have on our society. We talked about the tendency in these religions to see men as being the leaders, the more powerful figures, in the case of Judaism and Christianity, of seeing God as male, and the way that that ties into and perpetuates patriarchy. We talked about the way that the patriarchal father, the traditional father, is in some ways a reflection of this understanding of God. And we talked about those 3 P's, right? That they provide, they punish, and they protect. And that our expectations about how leadership should be done in a family often comes from, in part, these religious ideals that are then also a reflection of those. We talked about the ideas of modesty, and we talked about the story of Adam and Eve, and the way that particular ideas about women's sexuality and about the way that women's sexuality could be dangerous had permeated our culture and fed into things like slut shaming and so forth. We then talked about sexual violence. We talked about consent. We talked about how ideally consent should be active, enthusiastic, should be a yes, should be thoughtful about the dynamics of the situation, should be freely given, should be a joyful thing. We talked about things that are not consent but are sadly often taken as consent. We talked about the ways that differences in power, whether they're economic power, power of age, physical power, all kinds of different types of power, can undermine consent, can make consent impossible, can make consent difficult. And we talked about how the behavior of people who were survivors of sexual violence should never be understood to be consent. If they were acting in certain ways, dressing in certain ways, if they had particular sexual histories, that none of that means that they consented, that the only thing that we should understand as consent is a clear and enthusiastic yes, outside of the pressures of power that would undermine that. We talked about rape culture. The important thing about rape culture is that the way we act as a society, the culture that we create around sexual violence, has results for sexual violence. Specifically, it punishes, blames, shames victims, makes them scared of coming forward, causes secondary violence to happen to them, causes them to have the crime that was done to them made worse by the way the culture reacts. And then on the other side, rape culture helps perpetrators, helps people that do violence to people by supporting them, excusing them, covering for them, allowing them to continue in the power structure. But there was also good news about rape culture, which meant that we could change it. We can do things culturally that make life better for survivors, that make it less likely that perpetrators will get away with it, that make it so that perpetrators are less likely to reoffend, that make it harder for perpetrators and easier for survivors instead of the opposite. And we talked about some of the things like bystander intervention that can help with that, and most importantly, believing survivors. We then went on to talk about some of the history of feminism in the US. We broke this up into three waves. The first wave going from 1848 to 1920, the second wave going from the 1960s to the 1980s, and then the third wave starting in the 1990s and going to the present day. Broadly speaking, the first wave being concerned with the right to vote primarily, which they won for women in 1920. That's known as suffrage, winning the right to vote. The second wave concerned with entry into the workplace as well as reproductive rights. Roe v. Wade, the right to terminate a pregnancy being one of the major victories of that. Of course, the huge expansion of women into the workplace. And then with the third wave, a focus on intersectionality and a focus on cultural actions and things you've heard about in the news, such as Me Too, are definitely part of the third wave of feminism. Going back to talking about the first wave, we talked about how they focused on liberal institutions that women had been excluded from. Women had been excluded from these things that enabled access to power, specifically education, voting, property rights. We talked about how women were in many ways subservient to their husbands, were treated like children, where their husbands had all the power over them, and that existence of marriage as a system where men had power over women was crucial to challenge in order to advance women and bring about more equality for women in society. We talked about some of the shortcomings, it being a particularly middle class and white movement, but we also talked about how that was an overgeneralization, and there certainly were important people of color, important working class people, important radical politics within the movement at the same time. Then we went on to talk about capitalism some more. We talked about how capitalism was socially constructed, how it has existed only relatively recently, the past couple of 100 years in human history, and that it requires a lot of work from the government to keep it in existence. It's not just something that magically occurs in a natural state. We talked about the way that capitalism creates classes, the rich capitalists who tend to get richer, the workers who stay oppressed. We talked about the system of surplus value, which is the way that wealth moves from the work that workers do to the capital, the wealth that capitalists own. And then we talked about some of the negative consequences of capitalism, how it causes alienation, it separates us from each other, from our work, that it separates us from our feelings of fulfillment in the workplace. And also the way that capitalism is inflationary, how it wants to expand to new markets, to the use of more and more resources. We connected that to the destruction of the environment and also to colonialism. Talking of which, colonialism is the system where one country takes control of another land or people. It was massive for 600 odd years of human history, and there's few European countries that, led as the colonial powers, controlled most of the world during this time. We also talked specifically about settler colonialism. That's the particular type of colonialism where the indigenous population is replaced by the colonizing population or by people brought there. And of course, the US is an example of this, where in large numbers, the native indigenous population of the Americas has been replaced by people of European descent who came here as colonizers, and people of African descent who were brought here forcibly by the colonizers. So we live in a settler colonial country where the people who run the country today, the reason that they're in charge is the result of colonialism. We talked about the exchange of colonialism, how it moved wealth, resources from the global south to the global north. It impoverished the global south, enriched the global north, and that this, of course, has a huge legacy today in understanding the way that countries are in the world right now. And in particular, we related that to immigration patterns. The reason that we see people wanting to move from the global south to the global north is a result of this situation created by colonialism. We also talked about the role of capitalism in colonialism. And then we also talked about the more complicated exchange of culture. We talked about cultural colonialism. This is where the values of Europe, including values about gender and patriarchy and the way that women were supposed to behave, were brought to the rest of the world, were treated as superior, how people in the global south were treated as inferior, and in lots of cases treated as children that needed to be looked after by the wise, civilized men of Europe, and we described that as benevolent paternalism, right? We then went on to talk about Black history. We began talking about the incredible diversity that exists in Africa before the system of transatlantic slavery. We talked about some of the specific characteristics of chattel slavery, the type of slavery that was practiced in the US, and how this is importantly different from other types of slavery that have existed around the world through history. In particular, we talked about the way it was generational and racial, the way that people were born into legal slavery, the way that people were treated as property. We talked about the sexual labor in slavery, i.e. the widespread rape of enslaved people. We talked about the way that families were destroyed. We also talked about the ideology that came with enslavement, meaning the way of justifying it, the ideas, right? We talked about how people at the time knew that slavery was wrong, and so in order to justify continuing it, they came up with all these myths, with all these ideas to try and explain it, to try and justify it to themselves. And we talked about how many of those ideas, right, the idea of people of African descent as being lazy, the idea of people of African descent as needing to be helped, as needing white people to look after them, that paternalism, have persisted very much to the current day. We also looked at examples of agency, the way that enslaved people in some of the most oppressive situations didn't just put up with it, didn't just exist in this system as it was given to them, but instead resisted in all kinds of complicated ways, including violence, including culturally, including intellectually. Some of those successful and contributing to changing it, some of them just creating a space where people could have some individuality, some possibility of life within the system, and that ultimately this resistance led to the ending of slavery. We talked about the amendments that were passed about after the Civil War, the 13th that bans enslavement, the 14th that provides birth citizenship and equal protection of the law, and the 15th which provides the right to vote will not be abridged based on race. We watched the movie where we learned about that important caveat in the 13th that allows for punishment of a crime to be slavery, and we saw the ways in which the prison system today in many ways replicates some of the realities of slavery, though we also talked about how it is different in some ways. We talked about how following Reconstruction, which was this period of success and prosperity and political power for African Americans in America in the late 1860s, early 1870s, we saw a backlash. We saw this explosion of terrorism, of the Klan, of white supremacy, and the way that they really captured the government in many, many states, and that became the social structure. This is known as the Jim Crow system, leading to segregation. And we talked about the cultural myths that came with that and how many of them were gendered. We talked about this idea of the black male as dangerous, as violent, as not being able to control themselves. We talked about this idea of black women and a variety of different myths about black women. Some of black women in this position of servitude, right? The mammy, the help, the woman who provides for the white family cheerfully and lovingly, but who white people didn't care about her own family. We talked about the idea of the angry black woman who was, asking for too much, who didn't know her place. And then we talked about the sexualization of black women and blackness as entertainment. And again, these are myths that were created in order to maintain segregation, white supremacy, but have very much remained an important part of our culture today and are things we're still struggling with and fighting with. And then we talked about the programs of institutionalized racism. I don't think I said this on the slides, but I want to take a step back here. There's a lot that happened and is still happening with racism in America, but one thing that is important is a massive transfer of wealth. Remember we talked about surplus value with capitalism? Well, the extreme version of that is slavery, right? What happened during slavery, one way of understanding it, is that enslaved people were doing work that generated wealth, and that wealth was going to the people who had enslaved them. And that transfer of wealth, which happened for, decades, hundreds of years, that was, the entire economy of the US, or the vast majority of the economy, has never been changed. So that transfer of wealth maintains today. And we looked at some of the ways that in the north of America, in states that didn't have slavery, and in kind of liberal programs of the middle of the 20th century, that wealth disparity was increased, was maintained, so that we still have the same disparity, the same huge difference in wealth today. We then turn to the social construction of crime, meaning the way that crime is created by our society. I mean, the idea of what is a crime and what isn't is created by our society. It doesn't come from anywhere natural. It's not essentialist. We looked at the way that that's different from morality, and we looked at some examples of things that are immoral but are not crimes and shouldn't be. We looked at some examples of things that are crimes that probably should be crimes that are nevertheless not immoral. And we looked at all the different ways of combining those two things to demonstrate that while we construct the idea that being a criminal makes you immoral and not being a criminal makes you moral, that's not actually true, and that's socially constructed. And then we looked at that with sex work. We also looked at the comparison to the war on drugs, and we looked at some of the ways that the criminalization of sex work has harmed in particular women, and also to some extent gay men who disproportionately engage in that practice. And we looked at some of the ways that the police exercise power against particularly vulnerable communities through the criminalization of sex work, and how that drives people into the prison system in a similar way that the war on drugs does. We then turned to talk about reproductive health. I was pretty angry about abstinence-only education, as I recall, and perhaps the most important thing that you can take from this class for your life is to remember to back up your birth control, that multiple methods of birth control are far more effective than just any one method of birth control. We then talked about abortion. We talked about how, despite it being stigmatized, it's very common, or relatively common. We talked about how the reason that women have abortions, the main reason, is they don't feel like they're able to financially support the child, meaning that abortion is very much connected to capitalism. We also talked about the fact that the stereotype we have of women that have abortions that's presented in the media isn't really true, that it's mostly adult women, mostly women who already have children. We also talked about the danger of pregnancy and how all of those things, medical care, poverty, are affected by the other things that are important in our society. This is all intersectional. We talked about how this was based on the right to privacy, how it was the same right as in contraception, the same right as in the right to have sex with whoever you wanted to. We then talked about reproductive justice. This was thinking not just about what rights we have, but also who has access to them. We talked about the history of forced sterilization of women of color and of Native women. We talked about some of the ways that poorer and less advantaged women were targeted by the various laws, and we watched the movie looking at some of the effects of that. And then we ended by talking about paid maternal leave, about talking about the way that the US does not have paid maternal leave, how it's very unusual in the world for that. And I think that covers most of everything. I'm going to post another video talking about the final and what that's going to look like. And then I'm going to post another video looking at some of the big themes from the class that I've already talked about a little bit here, but I want to go in a little more detail. And so, yeah, thank you, everyone.